Fabulous. Okay, so moving on to our next panel, we have Pippa, who is a second-year PhD candidate in the School of Education, Communication and Society at King's College London, where they also teach on the BA in Social Sciences, and their research explores the experiences of LGBTQ+ volunteers in higher education. So, yeah, we'd like to fire away.
Brilliant. Yeah, thank you so much for being here, and thank you to everyone who's presented so far and who's organised this. This has been really amazing so far. Thank you. So yeah, I'll be talking today about my research on LGBT+ volunteering communities in higher education. So just to give some cultural and personal context to what I'll be talking about, my work is situated in England, specifically because during the 21st century, there's been a massive drive in England for legal and institutional inclusion of LGBT+ people into society, for instance, through adoption rights, protection from workplace discrimination, and for many people, this sort of culminated into the legal right to same-sex marriage in 2013. And similarly, in universities, LGBT+ communities are now not just tolerated, but they kind of are expected in a way. The vast majority of university providers in England have got outward-facing, volunteer-led LGBT+ student communities, and over half of universities have got outward-facing LGBT+ staff networks. So I was myself a participant in several of these communities at different institutions, and I found it really fascinating to compare how they differed from each other, how they were similar, and how their aims and their functions were described in various ways, and how the experiences by people who participated in these groupings was also variously described. What I'm particularly interested in is the fact that those sort of varieties of interpretations, varieties of experiences, sometimes seems to cause a lot of friction, especially when people use the same terminology to kind of mean different things, contradictory things, contrasting things. So for instance, when we talk about the LGBT+ community on campus, for some people that might index their personal group of friends that they go out with or get drunk with. It might mean people who are potential romantic or sexual partners. It could be a community that people want to maintain on ethical grounds, mutual aid reasons, feeling a sort of responsibility towards having this community. And for yet other people, in my experience, mostly managerial staff at university, the LGBT+ community can be a sort of an example of student entrepreneurship, to be displayed on the university website, or something for people to participate in, for to put on their CV. So having this more, I don't want to necessarily say corporate, but more entrepreneurial side of what it means to organize in these communities. So it's those sort of very varied, very complex, very contradictory sets of meanings that I'm addressing in my research, mainly because prior research on LGBT+ experiences in universities tends to be focused on finding out about LGBT+ well-being and finding out about this from a particularly quantitative point of view. And that research is obviously really, really valuable to the field, but it doesn't tell us a lot about how LGBT+ communities operate as communities, as well as how people can experience a lot of ambivalence around being in volunteering spaces within universities, where most of the time you're either paying to attend if you're a student, or volunteering for a place that's also your employer in the case of staff. These quantitative studies also tend to contain not that much critical attention to the university as an institution, and how this institution is seen by the communities. And for this more critical lens, it's necessary to turn to critiques of neoliberal universities more broadly. But then these are often made on a very theoretical level rather than using original data, or they don't necessarily focus on the university as it pertains to LGBT plus communities specifically. So it's my intention to sort of fill that gap between theory, between original data, and specifically focusing on LGBT plus communities. So in this presentation, I'm just very quickly going to outline the setup of my research, methodological grounding. I'm then going to discuss some findings arising from pilot interviews that I did, and then closing by outlining the next steps of my research and the purpose of my findings. If I can get my control panel back. There we go. Yeah, so I'm aiming to answer the following research questions, mainly through one-on-one interviews and focus group interviews. So firstly, to what extent do higher education institutions use LGBT friendliness or implied LGBT friendliness in their promotional material? What are LGBT plus volunteers' views on the roles of their work within the university system? How do LGBT plus volunteers experience the support or the lack of support from their institution of education with regards to working towards LGBT plus friendliness? And what do those findings suggest for the future of policymaking and practice around LGBT friendliness in higher education? And because I'm still doing my data collection, I'll primarily be focusing on the second and third question there. So I'm approaching this topic with a very post-structural view of language, of signification, community, and identity. So I don't consider all of those concepts to be self-evident or be very, natural in the, most commonly used sense of the word. I'm using them as terms that are constructed in and through language and power. At the same time, I am also taking a very emic approach to the insights that my participants give me about the communities that I interact with. So we'll be paying attention to to the ways in which patterns or associations become more or less self-evident or natural by my participant through repetition, through appeal to authority, through common sense claims, or claims to tradition. So the current stage of my research is that I'm conducting 20 one-on-one synchronous online interviews with people who are either current LGBT plus volunteers in higher education settings or people who have volunteered in these settings in the past. I need one more person for this research, exactly one. So if anyone here today works in this sector or has volunteered in this sector, please contact me, because I don't really want to put out a whole call for participants for just one person, because I'm then going to have to say no to a lot of people. Yeah, anyway, in these interviews, I am using a semi-structured interview schedule, and that kind of interview schedule allows me to sort of investigate a lot of unexpected matters that might arise in the interview, sort of as and when they occur. So that could include any narrative avenues that, if taken by themselves, I might initially consider a tangent. It can include any concepts, any dynamics that I'm not familiar with prior to the interview. So by using this semi-structured approach, I can sort of investigate how participants navigate their position as a volunteer, how they choose to narrativize their navigation without making any assumptions about what that navigation might look like. It's also important to note that through these interviews, I'm not intending to gain sort of objective view of volunteering life. I'm not really that interested in what, quote unquote, actually happens. I'm more interested in how people, experience these aspects of volunteering, how they frame their participation, what language they use to describe everyday activities, because sort of at its basis, it is a linguistic endeavor more so than anything. So once I've concluded those interviews, they'll be complemented with focus group sessions, which is partially to get a bit of a better overview about how participants discuss things among each other, but it's also a bit of an opportunity metatextually for participants to exchange experiences or share strategies or just network, which I think is really important to include in any kind of research on communities. So then when that's all done, I'm going to transcribe and code my participants' speech using in vivo and distill sort of recurring themes from that. And I'll do that by looking at repetition, contrast, similarity, and difference in their narratives. And these themes will then in turn be contrasted to material which is authored by universities like prospectuses, social media posts, videos, etc., just to see the extent to which they are similar or different from each other. So in order to create my interview schedule and to get a sort of initial idea of the direction of my research, I conducted some pilot interviews in 2021 with 3 participants who had volunteered for a student LGBT plus society in 2012 to 2017. The interviews were very sort of unstructured, and obviously 3 is a ridiculously low sample size, so I'm not drawing any generalizable conclusions from this, but just noting some points for further interests, or sort of like, using them as sort of orienting devices to look at what I'm going to do next. So one thing that I found really interesting was that all of my participants rooted the value of their volunteering work in connections to other people, and they worked really hard towards having new members join their LGBT plus society, and that was often contrasted with disappointment regarding their own experiences of feeling unwelcome or being intimidated when my participants first had their initial contact with LGBT plus communities. And it was also contrasted with seeing other people feel really isolated or really insecure during the events that they put on. It was also really interesting to me that my participants chose these goals as a sort of primary marker of success, rather than goals that might be a bit more easily measurable, like, for instance, implementing a particular policy or campaigning on a certain issue, which is, is very quantitative goal. You achieve it or you don't. Whereas making people feel comfortable, you can't really measure it. So my further research is then going to aim to sort of flesh out how value in general is constructed within these LGBT plus volunteering communities in relation to these kinds of intangible things of comfort, security, and particularly the extent to which they align with or differ from normative ideas of reproductive futurity and kinship and family and such. My participants also noted that they found it really difficult to juggle responsibilities and to commit resources and time and effort to their society while also doing a degree or working sometimes, as in doing paid work. And given the sort of continued increasing cost of education, especially post 2012, the financial precarity that COVID-19 has brought with it, and the increasing cost of living, it will be really interesting to see how current LGBT plus volunteers work to create that balance between their education, their income, and their unpaid work. Let me see, just for time-wise, I'm just going to say welfare and diversity were really used in very ambivalent ways. And it was really interesting to see that the ways that my participants used them and the way that they understood the university to use it were not necessarily in line with each other. So I'll be looking at that as well, especially because there's already been quite a lot of work on welfare within the university, or sorry, not welfare, particularly diversity and equality within the neoliberal university. So I'm currently in the final stages of conducting my interviews, if I can find my last participants who want to be interviewed. They're sort of roughly evenly split between staff participants and student participants. They've included people from a variety of institutions, that's Russell Group, non-Russell Group, pre-92, post-92 institutions, single campus universities, multi-campus, collegiate universities, people who primarily work and study online, as well as a lot of participants who work and study across academic disciplines, and some discipline-specific groups as well as those who work in professional services. So it's not just academics or students, it's also people who are supporting staff at universities. Yeah, and I'm currently transcribing the last of these interviews. And then when I've made my sort of first steps into the formal analysis, I'm going to contact all my participants again to take part in a follow-up focus group, and present my early findings to them as points for discussion. Again, mostly to allow participants a bit of time to network and strategize with each other, but also to give me the opportunity to check in with my participants' view on my analysis, and give them the opportunity to challenge any preliminary conclusions, which is really important, I think, because it's, I'm doing this research to benefit these communities, so they should have some sort of say in what happens. And sorry for going a bit over time, but that concludes my share of the presentation. And thank you so much for taking the time to listen to it. And yeah, please feel free to get in contact with me after the conference as well. Thank you for symposium. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Pippa.